This recording was made possible through the support and cooperation of the Collectors Admiralty. The book is available at TCA Central Library, which can be visited at Shop 1920, First Floor, Saman Plaza, Westridge Bazaar, Rawalpindi. For more information about the book and TCA, send an email to thecollectorsadmiralty.gensec@gmail.com. More details are also provided in the description box below. The Maxwell Equations, Chapter 2. The next day I waited for the noon mail with mounting impatience. When the bell rang at 11:30, I jumped up and ran to meet the postman. To my surprise, I faced a slim, pale girl holding an enormous blue envelope in her hand. "Are you Professor Roch, please?" she asked. "Yes. Here's a package for you from Kraftstutz. Please sign here." There was only one name, mine, on the first page of the ledger that she held out for me. I signed and offered her a coin. "Oh no," she flushed, murmured goodbye and was gone. When I glanced at the photocopies of a closely written manuscript, I couldn't believe my own eyes. From an electronic computer, I had expected something entirely different. Long columns of characters with the values of the arguments in the first column and those of the solution in the second. But what I held in my hand was a strict and precise solution of my equations. I ran my eyes through page after page of calculations that took my breath away with their originality and sheer beauty. Whoever had done it possessed an immense mathematical knowledge to be envied by the world's foremost mathematicians. Almost all the modern armory of mathematics has been employed, and also had been employed. The theory of linear and non-linear differential and integral equations, the theory of the functions of a complex alternating current, and those of groups and of plurality, and even such apparently irrelevant systems as topology, number theory, and mathematical logic. I nearly cried out in delight when at the end of a synthesis of countless theorems, intermediate calculations, formulae and equations, the final solution emerged. A mathematical formula taking up 3 whole lines. And to add a touch of the exquisite, the unknown mathematician had given himself the trouble of resolving the long formula into a simpler one. He had found a brief and precise form containing only the more elementary algebraic and trigonometric expressions. At the very end, on a small inset, there was a graphic representation of the solution. I could wish for nothing better. An equation which I thought could not be solved in the final form had been solved. When I had recovered a little from my initial surprise and admiration, I went through the photocopies again. Now I noticed that he who had solved my problem had been writing in great hurry and very closely, as though trying to save on every scrap of paper and every second of time. Although he had written 28 pages, and I pictured mentally what a titanic work that had been. Try and pen a letter of 28 closely written pages in one day, or just copy, without following the meaning, 28 pages out of a book, and you will surely find it a hellish job. But what I had in front of me was not a letter to a friend or a chapter copied out of a book. It was the solution of a most intricate mathematical problem done in 24 hours. For several hours, I studied the closely written pages, my surprise mounting with each hour. Where had Kraftstutz found such a mathematician? On what terms? Who was he? A man of genius nobody knew? Or perhaps one of those wonders of human nature that sometimes occur on the borderline between the normal and the abnormal. A rare specimen Kraftstutz had unearthed in the wise men's home. Cases have been recorded of brilliant mathematicians ending their days in a lunatic asylum. Maybe my mathematician was one of those. These questions plagued me for the rest of that day. But one thing was clear. The problem had not been solved by a machine, but by a man, a mathematical wizard the world knew nothing about. The next day, a little calmer, I reread the whole solution for the sheer pleasure of it this time, just as one will listen and again to a piece of music one loves. It was so precise, so limpid, so beautiful that I decided to repeat the experiment. I decided to give Kraftstudt Co. one more problem to solve. That was easy, for I was never short of challenging problems, and I chose an equation which I had always thought impossible to break down so that it could be handled by a computer, let alone be finally solved. This equation too dealt with radio wave propagation, but it was a specific and very complex case. It was an equation of the type that theoretical physicists evolve for the fun of it, and soon forgot all about because they are much too complex and therefore of no use to anybody. I was met by the same young man blinking in the daylight. He gave me a reluctant smile. I have another problem, I began. Nodding briefly, he again led me all the way through the dark corridors to the bleak reception hall. Knowing the drill now, I went up to the window and handed him my equation. So it's no computers that do these things here. As you see, he said, without looking up from my equation. Whoever solved my first problem is quite a gifted mathematician. The young man did not say a word, deep as he was in my equation. Is he the only one in your employ, or have you several? When has that been relevant? What has that to do with your requirements? The firm guarantees. He had no time to finish, for at that moment the deep silence of the place was shattered by an inhuman scream. I started and listened. The sound was coming from behind the wall, beyond the partition. It was like somebody being tortured. Crumpling the sheets with my problem, the young man, throwing a side glance as seizing me by the hand, dragged me to the exit. What was that? I asked, panting. You'll have the solution the day after tomorrow at 12. You'll pay the bearer. With those words, he left me by my taxi. Chapter 3. It is hardly necessary to say that after this event my peace of mind was completely gone. Not for one moment could I forget that terrible scream, which had seemed to shake the very stone walls sheltering Kraftstudt and Co. Besides, I was still under the shock of finding such a complicated problem solved by one man in one day. And finally, I was feverishly waiting for the solution of my second problem. If this one too was solved, then it was with shaking hands that 2 days later I received a package from the Kraftstudt's girl. By its bulk, I could tell that it must contain the solution to the monstrously complicated piece of mathematics. With something akin to awe, I stared at the thin creature in front of me. Then I had an idea. Please come in. I'll get the money for you. No, it's all right. She seemed frightened and in a hurry. I'll wait outside. Come on in. No point in freezing outside, I said, and all but dragged her into the hall. I must have a look first to see whether the work's worth paying for. The girl backed against the door and watched me, and waited with wide open eyes. It is forbidden, she whispered. What is? To enter the client's flats. Those are the instructions, sir. Never mind the instructions. I'm the master of this house and nobody will ever know that you've entered. Oh, sir, but they will. And then? What then? I said, coming nearer. Oh, it's so horrible. Her head drooped suddenly and she sobbed. I put a hand on her shoulder, but she recoiled. Give me the 700 marks at once and I will go. I held out the money. She snatched it and was gone. Opening the package, I nearly cried out with astonishment. For several minutes I stood there, staring at the sheaf of photo paper, unable to believe my own eyes. The calculations were done in a different hand, another mathematical genius, and of greater caliber than the first. The equations he had solved in an analytical form on 53 pages were incomparably more complicated than the ones I had handed in the first time. As I peered at the integrals, sums, variations, and other symbols of the highest realms of mathematics, I had a sudden feeling of having been transferred into a strange mathematical world where difficulty had no meaning. It just didn't exist. That mathematician, it seemed, had no more difficulty in solving my problem than we have in adding or subtracting two-digit numbers. Several times I tore myself away from the manuscript to look up a thing in a mathematical manual or reference book. I was amazed by his skill in using the most complex theorems and proofs. His mathematical logic and methods were irreproachable. I did not doubt that had the best mathematicians of all nations and ages, such as Newton, Leibniz, Gauss, Euler, Lobachevsky, Weierstrass, and Hilbert, seen the way my problem had been solved, they would have been no less surprised. When I finished reading the manuscript, I fell to thinking, where did Krafft get these mathematicians? I was convinced now that he had a whole team of them, not just two or three. Surely he couldn't have found a computer firm employing only 2 or 3 men. How had he managed it? Why was his firm next door to a lunatic asylum? Who had uttered that inhuman scream behind the wall? And why? Krafft hammered in my brain. Where and when had I heard that name? What was behind it? I paced up and down my study, pressing my head with my hands, tasking my memory. Then I again sat down in that genius-inspired manuscript, delighting in it, rereading it part by part, losing myself to the world in the complexities of intermediate theorems and formulae. Suddenly I jumped up because I recalled that terrible, inhuman scream once more, and with it came the name of Krafft. The association was not fortuitous. No, it was inevitable. The scream of a man tortured and Krafft. These naturally went together. During the Second World War, a Krafft served as investigator in the Nazi concentration camp at Graz. For his part in the murders and inhuman treatment, he got a life sentence at the Nuremberg trials. I remembered the man's photo in all newspapers in the uniform of a SS Obersturmführer in a pince nez, with wide open surprised eyes in a plump, good-natured face. People wouldn't believe a man with such a face could have been a sadist. Yet detailed evidence and thorough investigation left no room for doubt. What had happened to him since the trials? Maybe he had been released like many other war criminals. But what had mathematics had to do with it all? What was the connection between a sadistic interrogator and the solutions of differential and integral equations? At this point the chain of my reasoning snapped, for I was powerless to connect these two links. Obviously there was a link missing somewhere, some kind of mystery. Hard as I beat my brain, however, I could think of nothing plausible. And then that girl who said, "They will know." How scared she was. After a few days of tormenting guesswork, I finally realized that unless I cracked the mystery, I would probably crack up myself. First of all, I wanted to make sure that the Krafft in question was that same war criminal. Chapter 4. Finding myself at the low door of Krafft & Co. for the third time, I felt that what was to happen next would influence my whole life. For no reason I could understand then or later, I paid off the taxi and rang the bell only after the cab swung round the corner. It seemed to me that the young man with his crumpled old mannerish face had been waiting for me. Without saying a word, he took me by the hand and led me through the dark subterranean maze into the reception hall where I had been on the 2 previous occasions. "Well, what brings you here this time?" he asked in what seemed to be a mocking tone of voice. "I wish to speak to Herr Krafftut personally," I demanded. "Our firm is not satisfying you in some way, Professor?" he asked. "I wish to speak to Herr Krafftut," I insisted, trying not to look into his prominent black eyes which now shone with malicious mockery. "As you wish. It's none of my business," he said after a long scrutiny. "Wait here." Then he disappeared through one of the doors behind the glass partition. He was gone over half an hour and I was dozing off when a rustle came to me from a corner, and out of the semi-darkness stepped a white, smoked figure with a stethoscope in hand. "A doctor," flashed through my mind, "come to examine me. Is this really necessary to see Herr Krafftut?" "Follow me," the doctor said peremptorily, and I followed him, having no idea what was to happen next and why I had ever started it. Light filtered into the long corridor in which we now were through a skylight high up somewhere. The corridor ended with a tall, massive door. The doctor stopped. "Wait here. Herr Krafftut will see you presently." In about 5 minutes he opened the door wide for me. "Well, let's go," he said, in the tone of a man who was regretting what was going to happen. I obediently followed him. We entered a wing with large bright windows, and I shut my eyes involuntarily. I was brought out of my momentary stupor by a sharp voice. "Why don't you come up, Professor Rauch?" I turned to my right and saw Krafftut in a deep, wicker-work chair, the very man whom I remembered so well from the newspaper pictures. "You wish to see me?" he said, without greeting me or rising from his desk. "What can I do for you?" I controlled myself with an effort and went right up to his desk. "So you have changed your profession?" I asked, looking hard at him. He had aged in those 15 years, and the skin on his face had gathered into large, flabby folds. "What do you mean, Professor?" he asked, looking me over carefully. "I had thought, Herr Krafftut, or rather hoped that you were still." "Ah, yeah, I see." And he guffawed. "Times have changed, Rauch. Incidentally, it's not so much your hopes I am interested in at present as the reason that brought you here. As you can probably guess, Herr Krafftut, I have a fair knowledge of mathematics. I mean modern mathematics. I thought at first you had organized an ordinary computer center equipped with electronic machinery. However, I am now convinced that this is not the case. In your establishment, it's men who solve the problems, as only men of genius would solve them, and what is most strange, with monstrous, inhuman speed. If you like, I presume to come and meet you. More specifically, your mathematicians, who are indeed extraordinary men." Krafftut first smiled and then began to laugh quietly, then louder and louder. "I don't see the joke here, Krafftut," I said indignantly. "My wish appears ridiculous to you, does it? But don't you realize that anybody with an interest in mathematics would have the same wish on seeing the kind of solution I got from your firm? I'm laughing at something quite different, Rauch. I'm laughing at your provincial narrow-mindedness. I'm laughing at you, Professor, a man respected in the town, whose learnedness has always boggled the imagination of immature maidens and old spinsters, at the way you hopelessly lag behind the swift strides of modern science." I was staggered by the insolence of that ex-Nazi interrogator. "Listen, you," I shouted. "Only 15 years ago, your specialty was applying hot irons to innocent people. What right have you to prattle about swift strides of science?" Come to that, I wish to see you to find what methods you use to force the brilliant people in your power to perform work which would take men of genius several years or perhaps all their lives to do. I'm very glad I have found you. I consider it my duty as a scientist and a citizen to let all the people in our town know that a former Nazi hangman has chosen as his new trade to abase men of science, men whose duty has always been to work for the good of humanity. Krafftut got up from his chair and, frowning, approached me. Listen to me, Roch. Humish Klar Su. Take my advice and do not provoke me. I know you would come to me sooner or later. But jawohl, ich hatte nicht mir vorgedacht. I never imagined you would be such an idiot. Frankly speaking, I thought I would find in you an ally, so to speak, and a helper. What? I exclaimed. First, you explained to me by what honest or dishonest means you are exploiting the people who bring you profit. Before my very eyes, his face shrunk into a lump of dirty yellow skin. The pale blue eyes behind the pince nez turned into two slits that bore into me acidly. For a fleeting moment, I had a feeling of a thing being examined by a prospective buyer. So you want me to explain to you how honestly our firm operates. So you're not satisfied with having your idiotic sums done for you as they should be done in the 20th century. You want to experience for yourself what it means to be solving such problems. He hissed, his wild face a mask pulsating with rage and hate. I don't believe all is above board here. Your reputation is proof enough. And then I overheard one of your men screaming, "That's enough!" Krafftut barked. After all, I never asked you to come. But since you are here, and in such a mood, we'll make use of you whether you like it or not. I had been unaware that the doctor who had brought me there was standing at the time behind me. At a signal from Krafftut, a muscular hand closed on my mouth, and a piece of cotton soaked in something pungent was thrust under my nose. I lost consciousness. Chapter 5. I came to slowly and realized that I was lying stretched on a bed. Voices of men in a heated argument crowded in on me. For a while, all I knew was that their subject was scientific. Then, as my head cleared a little, I could understand what it was about. I can tell you this, your Nichols is no example. The coding of stimulation is highly individual, you know. What stimulates willpower in one man might stimulate something quite different in another. For instance, an electronic impulse that gives Nichols pleasure deafens me. When I get it, I've a feeling two tubes have been thrust into my ears with a couple of aircraft engines revving up at the other end. All the same, the activity rhythm of neuron groups in the brain doesn't differ much from man to man. That's what our teacher's taking advantage of, really. With not much success, though, a tired voice said. Nothing beyond mathematical analysis so far. It's all a matter of time. No shortcuts here. Nobody would introduce an electrode into your brain to examine the impulses because that would damage the brain and consequently the impulses. Now, a generator allows for a wide range of change in coded impulses, and that makes for experiments without damage to the brain. That's as may be, the tired voice demurred. The case of Gordon and Voigt don't bear you out. The former died within 10 seconds of being put into a frequency-modulated field. The latter screamed with pain, so the generator had to be switched off immediately. You seem to be forgetting the principal thing about neurocybernetics, friends, and that is that the network of neurons in the human body affect immense number of synapses. The impulses these transmit have their own frequency. As soon as you are in resonance with this natural frequency, your circuit gets tremendously excited. The doctors probing blindfolded, so to speak, and that we are still alive is pure chance. At that moment I opened my eyes. I was lying in a room that looked like a large hospital ward with beds lining the walls. In the middle stood a big deal table piled high with remnants of food, empty tins, cigarette stubs, and scraps of paper. The scene was lit dimly by electric light. I rose on my elbows and looked round. Immediately the conversation stopped. "Where am I?" I whispered, looking over the faces staring at me. A voice whispered, "The new chap's come too." "Where am I?" I repeated, addressing them all. "So you don't know?" asked a young man in his underwear sitting upright in the bed to my right. "This is the firm of Krafft, our creator and teacher." "Creator and teacher," I mumbled, rubbing my leaden forehead. "What do you mean? Teacher? He's a war criminal." "Crime is relative. It all depends on the purpose. If the end is noble, any action is good," trotted out my neighbor on the right. This piece of vulgar Machiavellianism made me look at the man with renewed curiosity. "Where did you pick up that bit of wisdom, young man?" I said, letting my feet down and facing him. "Herr Krafft is our creator and teacher," they suddenly began to chant in chorus. So I have landed in the wise men's home after all, I thought. "Well, friends, things must be very bad for you to say a thing like that," I said, looking them over again. "I bet the new boy has his maths in a frequency band between 90 and 95 cycles." A stout fellow shouted, half rising from his bed. "And he'll squeal with pain at no more than 140 cycles in the uniformly accelerated pulse code," bellowed another. "And he'll be forced to sleep by receiving a series of 8 pulses per second with a pause of 2 seconds after each series. I am certain the new boy will develop ravenous hunger if stimulated at a frequency of 103 cycles with a logarithmic increase in the pulse power." The worst I could imagine had happened. I was indeed among madmen. The strange thing, however, was that they all seemed to have the same obsession, the possible influence of some kind of codes and pulses on my sensations. They thronged round me goggle-eyed, shouting out figures, giving modulations and powers, betting on how I would act inside the generator and between the walls, and what power I was likely to consume. Knowing from books that madmen should not be contradicted, I decided not to start any arguments but to try and behave like one of them. So I spoke in as inoffensive a tone as possible to my neighbor on the right. He seemed just a bit more normal than the others. "Would you please tell me what you're all talking about? I must admit I'm completely ignorant of the subject. All these codes, pulses, neurons, stimulations." The room shook to a burst of guffaw. The inmates reeled with laughter, holding their sides, rocking and doubling up. The laughter became hysterical when I rose in indignation to shout them down. "Circuit number 14, frequency 85 cycles, stimulation of anger," somebody shouted, and their laughter crescendoed. Then I sat on the bed and resolved to wait till they came down. My neighbor on the right was the first to do so. Then he sat on my bed and fixed his eyes on mine. "Do you mean to say you really don't know anything?" "Word of honor, not a thing. I can't make head or tail of what you're saying." "Word of honor?" "Not a thing." "Word of honor, not a thing." "All right, we'll believe you, though you're certainly a rare case. Dennis, get up and tell the new boy what we're here for." "Yes, Dennis, get up and tell him all about it. Let him be as happy as we are." "Happy?" I asked, surprised. "Are you happy?" "Of course we are." "Of course we are," they all shouted. "Why, we know ourselves now. Man's highest bliss is to know himself." We will continue onward in the next installment of chapter 5, as well as the feature presentation of the story in the next installment. We thank the Collectors Admiralty again for allowing us to read their books and to make audiobooks of them and to present them and preserve them for future generations. Thank you.